everybody. So in today's video, I'm going to be guiding you through the notes for lesson 1.6, which is all about function notation combined with equations. So we're going to be doing something today called evaluating when we have function notation. Here are the steps you need to follow. Step number 1 is to rewrite the equation, but you're going to draw a parentheses instead of the x. So everywhere that you see an x, you're just going to have an empty parentheses. Then you're going to fill in the x value that is given in the directions into each one of those parentheses. There might be more than one spot. Then you're going to use your calculator and actually type in what you see on your paper to get a final answer. Now you will have to use fractions sometimes, and so this is your helpful calculator tip about how to make a fraction. You're going to hit the alpha button, which is green. You're going to hit the y equals button, which is gray, and then you're going to hit the enter button once you've typed in your fraction. So make sure you're following along and using your calculator to sort of play along, because we want to make sure you know how to type this stuff in before the test. All right, let's try an example. In this example, we were given a function with an equation. So we know that in order to calculate values for g of x, we have to use this equation. If my directions say find g of 10, what they're telling me to do is replace all of the x's with 10s. So first, I'm going to copy this equation with no x's. There's just going to be empty parentheses. You'll notice the g is still at the beginning, and then there's an empty parentheses. Then we have the equals, just like the original equation had, and then the -6, and then an empty parentheses, and then the +7. So it's this exact equation, it's just copied with no parentheses. Now the directions here are telling me to fill in the number -10 into all of those empty parentheses. So I'm going to have a -10 here, and I'm going to have a -10 here. I'm just filling in the -10 into both of those parentheses. Last but not least, I'm just going to type it in. Now, the only part that I need to type into my calculator is the right-hand side. We do not type anything from the left-hand side into our calculator. So we're just going to take this -10 and we're going to copy it down again with the G. And then on the right-hand side, if I type in -6 parentheses -10 +7, I should get 67 as my final answer. Let's try it again, but instead of having fill in the blanks, we're going to make our own blanks. So if my directions say find g of 3/4, the first thing I'm going to do is copy down the original problem with no x's, just parentheses. So I'm going to have g and then empty parentheses equals -6 and then empty parentheses and then +7. Because everywhere that you see an x, you're going to put an empty parentheses. Now I'm going to fill in my number. This is telling me to fill in 3/4 into both of these parentheses. So 3/4, 3/4. This is where that handy calculator tip is going to come in helpful. So the left side, we just copy down. On the right side, we're going to actually use our calculator and type this in. You're going to type in the whole thing all at once. So -6 parentheses, and then to type in the fraction, you're going to follow the fraction directions we just went over. And then you're going to put a parentheses and then a +7. So in the end, you should get as your final answer 5/2. And that's it. Let's try this a few more times just to make sure we've really got it. For problem number 1 here, we've got an equation and then we're asked to find f of 3. So what I'm going to do is copy my equation, but just copy it and put an empty parentheses any place I see an x. That means that I'm going to have an empty parentheses here and here. So I'm going to have f empty parentheses equals 7 minus 2 empty parentheses. Then I'm going to fill my number into both of those parentheses. So I'm going to have a 3 here and a 3 here. I'm going to copy down the f of 3. That's just the name of the function. We don't do anything with that. And I'm going to type the 7 minus 2 times 3 into my calculator. And that gives me 1. And this right here is my final answer for this problem. Let's try that again. So in problem number 2, I can see that I have an equation and then I have an x I need to be filling in. I'm going to go ahead and start by copying my equation, but with an empty parentheses everywhere I see a t. So these t's are all going to change to parentheses. So I'm going to have g and then parentheses, empty parentheses, equals -5 and then empty parentheses and then plus 1. Now I'm going to fill my 0.2 into both of those parentheses. On the left side, I'm just going to copy this down. So I'm going to have g of 0.2 equals, and then I'm going to use my calculator and I'm actually going to type this in. When I do that, I actually get 0 as my final answer, which is okay. You're going to get zeros sometimes, and that is legal. It's okay to get zeros. Last but not least, let's try a challenge. This problem looks a little bit different because it actually has an exponent in the equation, which is great. So what I can see here is I'm being asked to fill in the number -3. I'm going to copy this equation, and everywhere I see an x, I'm going to put an empty parentheses. So I'm going to have h and then empty parentheses equals and then empty parentheses, and then I'm going to copy the exponent of 2 minus 1. Now I'm going to fill in my number. So I get -3 filled in here, -3 filled in here. I'm going to copy this part of the equation. And then I'm going to type in this part of the equation. Now to make an exponent, look for the button on your calculator that looks like this. It should be right above where you see like the plus, minus, multiply, divide. So when I type this in, I should get as my final answer 8. And that's it. We have one more thing to talk about today, and that is how do you interpret these answers if there isn't a table or there isn't a graph? So we have to read our words carefully. Let's talk about problem 4. Now, in this problem, I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. I'm going to ask you to find a missing number and then interpret that answer. So it's important to read the directions because the directions will tell you what labels to use for X and use for Y. Problem number 4 says the equation gives the amount of money in a person's account after X weeks. X is weeks. It's telling me that. So when I am ready to interpret, I'm going to know that my X is the weeks. And since the problem says it's giving us the amount of money in a person's account, it tells us that the only other variable, Y, has to be the amount of money. So first, let's find M of 11. What this means is that we're trying to take the number 11 and we're trying to fill it into the equation. So I'm going to copy this equation, but everywhere I see an X, I'm just going to put an empty parentheses, which means I'm going to have M empty parentheses equals 45 plus 5 over 2 empty parentheses. Now I'm going to fill in the number 11. So 11 goes here, 11 goes here. Again, I'm going to copy the left side, m of 11 equals, and then I'm going to type in the right side. Now, when I type this in, I'm going to have to remember how to put a fraction. So you can always go back in your notes, and that's where we've got alpha y equals. So if we type that in, we're going to have 72.5. Now, that's the first part of my answer. The second part of my answer is to interpret those results. Now, based on the labels I already looked at, this guy, which is X, is going to be the weeks. And this guy, which is Y, is going to be the amount of money. So I'm going to write that in a sentence. After 11 weeks, there was $72.50. All right, last example. We're almost done with these notes. The equation gives the amount of water in a pond in gallons after X hours in the sun. Again, I'm going to ask you to do two things. I'm going to ask you to find a value and interpret it. So let's start by identifying what our variables mean. It says X hours in the sun. So off to the side, I'm going to write a reminder to myself that X is the hours in the sun. It also tells me I'm finding the amount of water in a pond in gallons. So off to the side, I'm going to write down for Y that it's the water in gallons. Now, it wants me to find W of 10. That means I want to plug the number 10 into the equation. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the equation, and all of the X's I'm going to replace with big empty parentheses. That means I'm going to have an empty parentheses here and one here. So I'm going to have W parentheses equals -3 parentheses plus 100. Now I'm going to fill in my value, so 10 and 10. Again, the left side, we're just going to copy down, so I'm going to have W of 10. And then on the right side, I'm going to calculate. So I've got 70 as my answer. This is the answer for the first part of the question. The second part of the question is about interpreting. So will be based on what I already wrote down. I know that this 10, which is X, is the hours. And I know that this 70, which is Y, is the gallons. So in a sentence, I would say, after 10 hours, there were 70 gallons. All right, that's it for today's notes. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.